have Thom, who's working on a master's by research to make the binaural head-related transfer functions in opcodes and Csound to improve them.
Can they be improved? Your one.
They're going to be improved.
Sorry. You let this guy into your institute.
Right. I'm going to make this as pain-free as possible for me, more than you. You seem like you're having the cracks, so it should be good. So first of all, for me, I think it's like Shane did it brilliantly. Narrative is the kind of way of getting things across. And just even first to start and explain who I am. So I'm the vice principal in STC. I work with Brian in Sound Training College. I teach engineering, and that's where my kind of the history I kind of come from. I was originally an electronic engineering student, got my degree, decided electronic engineering wasn't for me, and then got into sound engineering because music's far more fun. When I joined STC, I started doing my masters, and it's masters by research. So because I'm doing it on the binaural opcodes, I have the guy next door who is just knocking the door. Hey, Brian, hey, you've been absolutely perfect. But even to kind of talk about it, I want to start with why you get to it. Like again, what Shane's saying, the so what idea. And it's for me, it kind of starts at about the age of 15. And I had that first moment with music. I was a very, very late developer of music. I didn't have one of those musical households. Everybody grew up with parents with thousands of records and stuff. I didn't, and it was like I heard. It was 5 Years by David Bowie, and I got that first final moment where the hair stood up on the back of my neck and music just enveloped me. It was just full immersion. It was that level of emotion where you can hear him almost crying on the record, and that just immersed me emotionally in the music. So as I went on, I then got involved with production and sound engineering, and at every step of the stage it was about getting people involved, getting people listening and immersing them, kind of tying them into it. And if you listen to orchestral recordings, it's very, very different to being in an orchestral space. And it is that idea of immersion, being enveloped, being surrounded, being kind of taken over by it. And I love the idea then of the kind of binaural and the opcodes, being able to place that in reality, being able to place that where you can experience it, and it's anywhere. It's at home, it's walking down the street, but there's kind of multiple things. So firstly, and I hope this isn't too painful, what is binaural audio? So often people use the term stereo, and stereo is kind of a mistake with how we hear. The binaural idea is we have two ears, and these two ears they determine sound in 360-degree space all around us, and it's all about picking up these small differences between the ears. But at the same point, when we're doing binaural processing, it's aiming to give listeners or kind of concert goers the same experience on headphones or earphones. The exact same thing you get in the real world. Sound perceived in any direction, front, back, up, down, left, right, all around you. And the way that that's done is by mimicking exactly how sound behaves as it hits our ears. So there's kind of two ways to think about it. Firstly, there's a volume difference between the two ears. When you hear something on your left-hand side, it's louder and it's slightly quieter on your right. When you hear something on your left-hand side, it takes a small amount of time before it hits the right, so there's a tiny time delay. But within that, those two together, your kind of inter-aural time differences and your inter-aural intensity differences are kind of what builds that kind of head-related transfer function, what builds the kind of real-world physical processing of sound before it hits your brain. The thing to keep in mind though is both of those are frequency dependent. So if you think of how sound works, and I'm sure everyone is more than comfortable with this, I don't know, but we always think of low frequencies as emanating and omnidirectional, and high frequencies being very like a laser, very straight on. So when it comes to the head, if you're hearing a sound on your right and it's getting to your left ear, it can't get past your head, especially if you have a big giant Lego man head of wig like I do, a wig hair. And then low frequencies can kind of manage and move around. And then as sound reflects off the body, it's going to be processed, as you can kind of see here, as it shapes off the torso, as it shapes around the ears, it's moved, it's shaping the sound before it ever kind of hits you. Now, binaural has been around since the early 1900s. People were recording with two microphones trying to emulate that space since the 1900s. But it only kind of is getting to the point where I think it's now we're kind of more comfortable, more capable of it. It's similar to the way virtual reality visually has kind of evolved from single polygon, single triangle shapes and single kind of pixels to now where things look very, very real, very, very realistic. So the rising power of DSP, there's lots and lots of researchers who develop these kind of spatial acoustic transfer functions, these HRTFs, to describe that filtering as it comes in any direction before it hits the ear. And the filters we kind of describe, they used to emulate how the pinna, the fleshes and torso and the head shape the sound before it ever hits us. Now, the next kind of point for me, even before I get any further, hopefully this is the right side. Oh, no. I always do that. I always talk before the slides. I'm sorry. They have some examples of HRTFs, and they're just to see the frequency response of it. And one thing I think a lot of people miss is your left and your right are very, very different, and they always tend to be different. But before I talk about updating the opcodes, why is binaural processing important? And I think there's a couple of things that kind of goes in. This turns out to be a terrible picture, I do apologise. I think it really, really opens up composition. This is from Asantana. It's an Apex twin, it's basically Anastasia backwards. And what he did as part of the composition, he turned the grand piano into a player piano, suspended from the ceiling, and swung it like a pendulum to get that Doppler effect. And it happens over the heads of the crowd. I think being able to have the freedom to do that is absolutely amazing, but it's not something everyone gets an opportunity to do. Because you're not going to have a giant space. Someone's not going to let you hang up your grand piano and swing it above everybody's head. But if you can do that virtually, if you can emulate that, that opens up that whole world to you, where you can have a sound environment. Your compositions can now envelop and take over and immerse people. It's also, so your spatial music composition, it's great for that emulation of cinema surround sound, like everything Hans Zimmer does now has a 5.1 version that's released on the App Store, which is doing very basic binaural versions of it. Multimedia performance, interactive installations, and then the big thing that's coming up at the moment, and I think we were chatting about this earlier on, maybe someone else, the virtual reality and how the virtual reality, like Oculus Rift, and then the PlayStation virtual reality. At the moment, a lot of those are using kind of not very real binaural versions. They're like emulating ambisonics. They're emulating 8 speakers around. So you can hear those blank spots where it pans between speakers. Like in 5.1 when it pans behind you and it gallops. It's not smooth, it's not even. And with the visuals kind of upgoing and coming up, I think that's the next step to get that immersive sound environment with sound behind it. Again, it's that idea of immersion. Games are about pulling you into the environment, pulling you into the story, into the narrative. And one thing, I read something last year I thought was really, really interesting, and it wasn't about sound at all, and it was a psychological paper, and they were talking about understanding and kind of getting this depth of sense making. And when I first seen it, I thought the idea of sense making as a title was ridiculous. Very judgmental of me, I apologise. But it is a term that's used in psychology, and it's what they did is essentially they took participants and separated them into 2 sides. And on one side they just gave them a copy of a painting. Just there you go. Just look at it, take 5 minutes and come out and give us all the information you can about it. Take as much as you possibly can out of it. And on the second half, they had built a virtual environment for that painting where they brought people through a tour to see each room, each spot, each individual element of that painting. And they found that the people who had these virtual tours had a greater understanding. They had a level of abstraction. Like the third level of education, they were able to start to synthesize ideas that weren't necessarily directly in front of them. And I think it's an amazing thing to be able to do that musically. If you're able to take a listener and walk them through and lead them around a performance, I think it really opens up the educational aspect of music, where sheet music, instead of now becoming a stereo playing field in front of you, can be someone walking through a composition. Can be someone moving around. And of course, if you do a little bit more coding, a little bit more of a front end, you can then solo and interact with the elements. So if you're taking a complex piece of music, you can walk someone through it, they hit a spot, and all of a sudden it solos the violins and brings that to the forefront, or it solos the flutes. Now the key thing with this is whenever you're using HRTF opcodes, or you want to use like binaural systems, you need to either have the ability to capture or to source accurate data sets. If you're going to capture them, it's tough going, it's not an easy task. What happens is speakers are placed around a listener have microphones put in their ears, and then that is cloned in the sphere around. Essentially, it takes hours and hours to process and kind of play these, capture them. You're basically capturing impulse responses for every single spot or fixed degree angles around the room. And there are microphones that are kind of at the entrance to the ear canal, held in the ear. Often it's done with dummies rather than real people, just because it's hours and hours of sitting, and you can't trust that someone isn't going to start creaking their neck and moving about, and then all of a sudden everything kind of gets moved a little bit. So the test signals are normally an impulse, it's a click, or they use Galois sequences or swept sine waves to capture them. But it's not exactly perfect. It's not easy for the kind of average Joe Soap to do. And then again with that, what has to be undone is the frequency response of every other piece of equipment. So your microphones, your speakers, any preamplifiers that you use, anything that's going to color the elements, you need to kind of get that away from the contamination of what it's doing to response. And I think at the moment, a lot of research is based around the idea that it's a generalized data set, or it's a minimum phase data set, or it's the computationally cheapest data set. But pinnae and the shape, the bump, the ridges and stuff around their ears, they're like fingerprints. Every single person's is slightly different. You might have a bigger bump, they might stick out more out from your head, you might have less ridge here or more going on than someone else. And that's going to affect how your ears normally process that sound. So at the moment, the current opcodes use the MIT dataset, which is one that gets used again and again and again in research, because it's thought of as a well-working generalized HRTF. And it's a solution to the difficulty in kind of how it works, and the difficulty of acquiring your own at the moment. However, the issue I draw with this, I feel like that's a big statement, sorry. I think the thing that kind of arises with this is your generalized HRF is a bit like borrowing someone else's glasses. You might be able to see, things might get blurry, things might be kind of edged, they might be carnival, bent out of shape, but it changes things. And this might be a risky slide. The idea there is any bit of missing information changes your perception. I picked a man because I thought it might be sexist to pick a woman. But the idea there is that it leads your brain to a different conclusion. Although we can clearly see exactly what's going on in the left image, our brain wants to tell us that underneath those bubbles he is definitely naked. So within that, there's been a whole heap of research done on the audibility of HRTFs, but again it's focused either on comparisons between minimum phase HRTFs and generalized HRTFs, or entirely free field, real world and generalized HRTFs. So again, it's kind of, sorry. Sometimes they've come up with things like that there's no audible difference between minimum phase or your standard HRFs, but often buried in it you get little kind of snippets like this. So listeners would have been unable to kind of pick out empirical or perfect their own HRTFs in a sequence. They're answering roughly on par with choice, but hidden down in the ports from all subjects, the task was frustrating, it's difficult, and they felt they needed to guess. So when they're trying to test their localization, where they're identifying those sounds, it's not easy when it's generalized. It's not easy as if I just click in the room and you can hear exactly where that click happened. Sorry. Another thing that kind of crops up, and it was mentioned in a comparison between virtual source and free field stimulation, is that in other statistics that crop up, they often get amalgamated a little bit, or reversals. And the idea with reversals is, with these generalized data sets, you're hearing something in front of you that's supposed to be behind you, hearing something below you that's supposed to be above you. And they're called reversals or confusions. Often they'll just be omitted from statistics, or they'll be swapped. They'll go, right, it was supposed to be back, we'll swap it into the same hemisphere, and then it'll narrow it. So instead of it being 190 degrees incorrect, it becomes 10 degrees incorrect. Sorry. There are some more quotes, but essentially along the same kind of idea. The computationally cheap versions tend to be often assumed, but they're not always valid. They're applied or used, but a lot of times they're audibly different from measured HRTFs. So the ability to use any data set And that's essentially like hacking a hacked version of your own, a best fit, similar to glasses. Prescriptions come in fixed steps. Should be able to much more kind of improve that immersion and the idea of localisation. So there's been lots of research, both academic and commercial, into this, into HRTFs, into the binaural studies. But what tends to happen is they're not consistent. The number of samples taken, the degrees between each speaker set up as it's moved aren't the same. The length that you take each sample for doesn't tend to be the same. And that means that people tend to either keep them entirely private, or if you are easily able to get these kind of open source versions, that it doesn't necessarily match the binaural tools you already have. There'd be a different number of samples, they use in different degrees, they use in different spaces, and it becomes difficult to kind of utilise and put them together. So the good old boys in blue, the Audio Engineering Society, put together this social standard, and they came up to try and standardise it and make it as simple as possible, so that it could be kind of multiple data sets can be used, or they can mix and match and move along the way. So by utilising this, we can actually kind of develop the current opcodes so they're available for a best fit version for listeners. So rather than using the fixed MIT dataset there, you can test and work with a few different versions, see what's the best fit for you. But the requirements for the AES tend to be kind of these 6 points. Nice, simple, handy, easy, breezy, running through over the top. So it has to have a fixed measurement setup, whether that's kind of Cartesian, as in your X, Y, and Z, or whether that's your spherical azimuth, elevation, and radius from it. But it has to be defined, and it has to be available, it has to be arbitrary, so from the listener to your kind of emitters. This data itself should be self-describing and should be consistent. So that should be anything that's in there, all the information required about the measurement setup, about how it was taken, should be provided as metadata within the file. It should be flexible for multiple conditions, so multiple different listening points, different distances from emitters. It should make use for conventions, and that's predefined descriptions of the most common measurement setups. It should be available as a binary file with data compression, efficient storage, and then partial file support. So if it's updated, it's only the updated bits that have to be rewritten or stored in the file. So with this convention having changed, SOFA files, or spatially oriented format for acoustics, which is a mouthful and a half, they've started to become available. They've started to kind of crop up, and they've been put together. And the way they're done is they use the NetCDF, the Network Common Data Format. And that's basically software libraries and these self-describing, machine-independent data formats. It gives you the ability to create and access scientific arrays, essentially. So it's giving us a big block array, and we can in and grab each individual point. And what that means, essentially, anyone who downloads or utilises the NetCDF library, or incorporates into their C file, their opcode build, a NetCDF header, can access and parse information from that SOFA file. Now, currently, that's where I am in my development. Unfortunately, I don't have a build for you today. I'm not fancy like everybody else. And so I'm currently revising the opcodes as they stand to take away from being quite specific, as in fitting with the MIT dataset, and make it a bit more variable, make things flexible so that it can incorporate multiple size arrays, different amounts of samples, different lengths of samples. But within that, my aim as well is to keep it backwards compatible, so that all of a sudden everything that you've used before doesn't disappear, doesn't dissipate. Within the current opcodes, as they are, a lot of it has kind of been really, really robust. The functions, the algorithms for interpretation, so expanding those fixed points around the room for the samples are taken into full 360-degree space are really, really, really robust. They work, and they're going to be maintained. When we talked about this as well, if you listen to a HRTF or a binaural opcode with no reverb or no space, it can be very unnatural, which makes it kind of hinders the ability to use it for creative uses. Just a fraction, just a little bit, because we're so used to hearing a room around us. We're so used to hearing that little bit of reflection. Every S and T and P, I'm getting back off the doors and off the walls of the cupboards around us. So as it stands, I'm also looking to kind of improve upon those. What I would look at, my history is in sound engineering, my history is in production, more than coding or programming. I'm looking at and analysing the non-binaural and the kind of industry standard products. And the big front runner for that is probably Lexicon and Dave Greisinger, who's done a huge amount. He's researched a lot of surround sound reverbs, immersion, acoustic halls, and like they just an amazing quality from it. So the current Opcodes use a very, very clever room simulation reverb. And what it does is there's a few feedback delay networks that are built on the work of Schroeder and more of different sizes. And basically they take the mean free path of the room, the rough estimation of how long that reverb in the room should last, and then uses a best fit model. Very cleverly as well, all the delay times are based on prime numbers, so they're less likely to line up. You're not going to get like 100 milliseconds, 200, 300, 400, and build up on those fixed points. But Greisinger's research and his reverb algorithms work slightly differently. So it's not about what happens in a real room, looking at the reflections and transfer properties. It's how do we perceive rooms. So it's a perception-based model. It's understanding what's audible to humans and what's not, how it interacts with how we perceive speech and music. So it defines things like 0 to 50 milliseconds for localization, 50 to 160 for reducing intelligibility, and then that immersion, that encapsulation being from 160 milliseconds on with reverbs. So Lexicon use kind of randomization techniques, which means that the reverb patterns are always changing ever so slightly. Not to the point where you're actually hearing them as audible pitch modulation or chorusing, and they're also changing in each speaker in a different way at each point. The modulation is actually very, very difficult to perceive because a lot of it happens before 50 milliseconds. So 0 to 50 milliseconds, it's like faster than a flam. You're hearing it as one and the same, not two individual hits. And that severely inhibits it. There was an interesting discussion, kind of great, Dave Greisinger himself did, not just about the reverb opcodes, but when he was talking about binaural techniques for music reproduction. And he did it a couple of times. He did it in 1990, he did it in 2009, and I think he did it 2 years ago as well. That he was kind of raising a couple of points. He was like that earphones are problematic, not just for binaural reproduction, not just for you as a listener to actually take this binaural into it, but what a lot of people don't realize is they're problematic for normal stereo listening as well. If you place earphones on the pinnae, so squishing down your ear, it's going to alter the frequency response of the ear. If you're skipping straight into the ear canal, it's going to affect the frequency response of the ear. Or if you're circumaural, if you're up and around the ears, you're basically giving it a little chamber that it can reflect, it can build in, and it can actually kind of build up to resonances, especially above kind of 5K. So one thing he suggested, and I thought was very, very interesting, and something I think is going to be incorporated as part of this to build up the immersion, is EQing headphones. The way he presented it, I thought was a very, very interesting kind of point, is that if we play pink noise through a set of speakers or through a set of headphones and listen to it, we don't hear it as centre of our nose, perfect centre. Because of this effect this is having on our ear, we're either skipping that the two ears are slightly different, so we're skipping by having straight inside the ear. You're not having that signal processing that normally happens. If you're squishing your pinna, you're changing your frequency response of your ears. If you're coming around it, you're adding resonances. So you're not ever really getting the true dead center monaural pink noise. So his suggestion is it can be EQ'd against. So using 1/3 octave bands graphic EQs, you can roughly center it and shape it to help correct it, to make that monaural point very central, very dead center, and even it out. And that improves both normal stereo listening, and but by correcting for how your ears are expecting to hear it, that it'll also improve your binaural hearing and localization within that. Sorry, apologies. So within that, I'm still a lot to do. There's still a lot to do. I'm kind of dying, like exactly centered in the middle of the build. But I think you can see from these points the little bit of reverb, the EQing of headphones, and the use of binaural. It's all about immersion. It's all about bringing people into the music. It's about encapsulating and waving the music over it. Thinking about both people. That's me. If anyone has any questions, I'm going to run out the door uncomfortably. Ski fast. Thanks.
Any questions?
I was only joking about it.
So at the moment, are there more and more data sets available for people to use, like ours?
They are cropping up a whole lot. So there's the best resource is selfconventions.org, where it's some of the guys from the AES are just trying to like converting data sets up as self files, converting data sets up as self files. There still isn't a huge abundance of them, but anything that was kind of freely available, like the KEMAR or the CIRAC and the MIT data sets, have already been converted, and as people are kind of doing them all the time.
And is there no way to algorithmically generate like fairly convincing data sets? Or like, are they not using some kind of modeling techniques now?
There has been some research into virtual modeling of the ear, where people are kind of taking pictures and stuff, but they're getting it's approximations, because they're not measuring the depth, the angle from the head. The depth, you would need much more. It still will be very difficult for most people, because you need to fully 3D map the head to get every single angle and actually how deep each bump is. So it kind of feels like best fit. A bit like Picasso. Is it a real face, or is it roughly approximation of the face?
So the software standard is quite new as well, so
Yeah.
kind of ahead of the curve, I suppose.
Yeah, it's not developed long. It's been in talks for a while, but it went from 0.1, and it's just kind of released the early start of last year as this new standard.
Does the standard include a file format? Say, defining a header and, what type of data, whether it's single engine, big engine, or...
Sorry?
Do you know whether the standard also includes a file format, like,
Yeah, so the NetCDF side of it defines it has to be in a fixed set of definitions.
Right.
So it'll define your number of samples, the degrees between it. It'll give you the full measurement set as the header part of the file before it gets into the actual scientific array.
Yeah, so possibly you could design it so that the actual codes that are there can be reused for this. If someone gives a file header, a file name, and the file is read as a header, then it uses this system. If it doesn't have a header, then it defaults back to the...
It goes back to the MIT data set.
Yeah. So that you don't need to... I'm just thinking here of the multiplicity of codes. You want to try to keep it to the same
codes.
Yeah.
But that's what I've been looking at as well, because I think it's a key point to keep it backwards compatible. So it's not like the old data set gets removed and then you're...
Well, that's the key. You have to be backwards compatible, but you want to do it so that you don't do it by multiplying the number of codes.
Yeah.
John, I'm not sure, I may have missed this when I was listening. How you thought of pre-processing it so I have my own individual file that fits me,
Yes.
rather than having to sort of reprocess it every time? I mean, you've got a fixed format, we've got lots of options.
No, I know what you're saying. So rather than making it entirely variable, have it that as soon as you're comfortable and you're confident that this new data set fits you, have your version that parses out.
Yeah.
I've considered it, but I'm not 100% exactly in terms of that.
The cost of startup.
As in computational costs, you don't want to you don't kill a lot of time.
I haven't got a feel for it, so I don't know how much you're going to have to do. But I'm just suspicious.
No, I do. I understand. I get the point fully. It's something I think that would be taken into consideration. Something I've chatted about with Brian before, but haven't arrived at a fixed answer about that yet.
Okay.
So I think the two ways to do it would be to have a tool that acts as a front end when you find the full data set, you parse out, and then there's a file that just gets like the guy's file where you just have a WAV in the folder that can be pulled up and used. So it is computationally cheaper, but then again, you might want to, depending on if you're putting it as an installation, you might want to still have someone do like a HTML5 test so they get their best fit at the same time. I have considered it, yeah.
I mean, the efficiencies to use the format that is there are not that, well, they wouldn't be that significant, would they? I mean, the format as it is now against the new format, the ADS one, you know, there's very little efficiencies that you built into that.
Yeah, very similar, yeah.
So
So
I don't think there's much gain in.
At the moment it's fixed locations.
Yeah.
And the idea is to make those locations variable, so just updating the current opcode would work that way.
Yeah. So there will be no gain of doing pre-processing of it to transform into the format that we have.
Well, the format that we have is currently spectral, so even that's a gain, isn't it?
Yeah. Just one couple of FFTs.
But you know, if it's performance, which you're worried about, I suppose, pre-programmed data is important at that.
Awesome. Yeah, you have to measure.
I think
It's
we're
very
near where
difficult to
that's
say
the next
whether these-
step.
Yeah.
How expensive the FFTs are. They're not that expensive.
There's a couple of options for sure.
Yeah, we've discussed it. Several
Write it
times.
down and think about it later.
And you know we have one option now where the FFT backend can be changed non-bound, so we can get more efficient FFTs as plugins if you need.
Yeah. I think the choice of dataset will be a big improvement.
Yeah, I think so.
The individualization is very important. It appears for it. Really, you get this moment where it clicks and you really start to, the localization is much better all of a sudden when it's more individualized to you. So
I
hopefully
think
we get that.
the other alternative with that seems to be there's been a fair amount of research done into training with it. So if you just pick a generalized data set and it's just almost training the ear, it's like passive feedback networks where people have an app and test and get an answer and test and get an answer and test and get an answer. And after a couple of weeks they can train themselves into having good localization in a generalized set.
Or they could use their headphones as their mobile phones as a microphone with headphones, so they don't need to take the headphones anymore out of their ears.
So are these data sets then basically storing filter coefficients for each point in space?
Yes, so they essentially are taking that 1.1 degree around the sphere that has been fixed and decided upon whether it's like forward 5 degrees and up 6, and saving that as a filter so you can pass the audio through it.
Because the problem I've had in the past is with continuous movement, that there's no guarantee that there won't be discontinuities between filter coefficients.
The current opcodes have a really strong understanding in terms of how it interpolates the data, so it fills in the blanks between each individual. The current opcodes, there's several builds, one where it's very fixed and you have to sit into one of the sample points, but there are it's a very strong in terms of both the dynamics, so movement away from a source, and how the audio affects it, and interpolating data between sample points, so that the continuous movement, if it's not too fast, if it's not to the point where you're creating a Doppler, is very strong, very believable, very robust.
Well, that's
That's a lot of very for Brian's face.
Brian's PhD, so
Many late nights trying to solve that. Thanks very much, Tom.
Do the normal datasets also contain inter-aural delay information or just filtering? Because when I was working with the HRTF Opcodes, I've had the impression that they just contain filtering, but not the delay, and I added the delay according to each position in space of the sound, and it opened up much better. So is this possible that these data sets do lack the delay times?
Some of the data sets have been prepared, and it's the idea of minimum phase approximation where they've taken off the slight, because obviously when you take a ping, a point, and it reads in one ear and reads it out, it reads from that point of the ping, so it's recording the silence, the gap beforehand. Some of the data sets have intentionally chopped that off to be minimum phase, to try to be more efficient, to take some of that delay out, and with that they often try and then do an approximation of that delay back in but that actually changes the phase relationship within it. If you take a minimum, that delay off. So some of the datasets have other issues in terms of that. I think, does that answer?
Yeah.
Sorry, I felt like
Yeah, I was just trying to check if my impression could have been right. Because
But there is the fact is not only filtering, it's both amplitude and phase. So the sound that's coming from this direction has a certain amplitude and phase, which is different from this. So when it's not only the amplitude differences, and like the filtering differences, but also the phase differences. But it's a fixed. The data sets are always measured at a fixed distance. So the delay, the total, like the group delay or the total delay, it's going to be the same. This is always the same around you. What's difference is the difference is small difference in phase between here and here, for instance.
isn't the phase also a bit, a bit like delay, because if it's delayed,
phase,
it will have another phase. So.
Yeah, its phase is delayed, but it's different from it's a very small amount. But that's encoded in the HTRF.
I see.
So it is inherent in the current.
Yes, it should be there.
It's in there.